Neville Goddard, The Law and the Promise, Chapter 6, Visionary Fancy. The nature of visionary fancy or imagination is very little known, and the external nature and permanence of its ever-existent images is considered as less permanent than the things of vegetative and generative nature. Yet the oak dies as well as the lettuce, but its eternal image and individuality never dies, but renews by its seed, just so the imaginative image returns by the seed of contemplative thought. Blake. That's very interesting because while reading that, switching over to the Seth material for the fun of it, there was a point where there was a discussion about an animal that was eaten by another animal as prey. And it was, I think the subject was, maybe it was a rabbit or it was a smaller creature taken down by a larger creature, predatory situation. And both animals know their place in the whole scheme of things. So when one falls and the other takes it and it's now then ingesting that animal, the animal, for lack of a better phrase, and I forget how Seth put it, that animal's spirit basically keeps running because the image of the animal doesn't go extinct when the animal's taken by another, because that animal's going to continue. Like Neville has, somewhere he talked about the flowers, and, they're always going to be. I forget where Neville said it, but basically flowers are always coming every season because they die in a certain season, but they always come back. It's the same with creatures and the same with us. That animal that gets taken by another as prey, that one animal's eaten, but the spirit of that animal keeps going because it's always going to show up. It's very fascinating the way it was said in that paragraph by Blake, because it very much is, and I will repeat it, the nature of visionary fancy or imagination is very little known, and the external nature and permanence of its ever-existent images is considered as less permanent than the things of vegetative and generative nature. There it is, permanence of its ever-existent images. Yet the oak dies as well as the lettuce, but its eternal image and individuality never dies, but renews by its seed, just so the imaginative image returns by the seed of contemplative thought. Powerful, powerful paragraph by Blake. I can see why Neville put it in here. The images of our imagination are the realities of which any physical manifestation is only the shadow. Now we've gone over that. Remember 4D, 3D. If we are faithful to vision, the image will create for itself the only physical manifestation of itself it has a right to make. We speak of the reality of a thing when we mean its material substance. That is exactly what an imaginist means by its unreality or shadow. Let me go back and complete that idea. It came to me right after I turned the camera off. What Neville was talking to the students about who came back after they climbed the ladder, that whole point in the end of the last video, was I was wanting to bring up the idea that if you're trying to fall asleep, imagining what your desire is and how you're making that impression, and you're constantly going over here and you're falling asleep and you're trying to go back to the beginning, try again, back to the beginning, you fall asleep too fast or you're never getting a real grip. And we talked about maybe going 3 weeks. How do you get that far if you keep falling asleep? And there was a point that Elmer in that video brought up that Neville told them to do was, I said go to bed a little earlier, but it dawned on me what he said in his video was go to sleep in an awkward position. And I've heard it said also hold a ball in your hand, like a baseball or a softball or an orange or whatever. If you're laying on your side, for instance, and you're holding your orange like this, because it's this way, here's your side, then whatever's in your hand, or maybe even your cell phone, whatever's in your hand is going to, when you fall asleep, it's going to drop and it's going to alert you. So then you go back to the beginning of your imagined, desired end, whatever the end you're focused on. So if you're focused on getting married, being in love, having a spouse, then you're going to be imagining yourself walking down the aisle, but then you're falling asleep and then you drop your phone or you drop a ball, or you sleep in You lay down in a position you would never lay down, so you don't go right to sleep. So you get this pump primed of these imaginations. You get this going. So you're preventing by falling asleep by holding your phone or a ball. It falls, wakes you up. You start over, do it again. Go to sleep on a side you wouldn't sleep, that you wouldn't fall asleep on normally. That way you're kept awake by that maneuver, and that keeps you in the game for a little while longer. And that gives you a little bit of a way to balance keeping yourself alert enough to keep that imagination rolling. So try that. All right, back to it. Imagining is spiritual sensation. Enter into the feeling of your wish fulfilled. Through spiritual sensation, through your use of imaginal sight, sound, scent, taste, and touch, you will give to your image the sensory vividness necessary to produce that image in your outer or shadow world. Here is the story of one who was faithful to his vision, F.B. Being a true imaginist, remembered what he had heard in his imagination. Thus he writes, a friend who knows my passionate fondness for opera tried to get Kirsten Flagstad's complete recording of Tristan and Isolde for me at Christmas. In over a dozen record stores, he was told the same thing. RCA Victor is not reissuing this recording, and there have been no copies available since June. On December 27th, I determined to prove your principle again by getting the album I desired so intensely. Lying down in my living room, I mentally walked into a record shop I patronized, and I asked the one salesman whose face and voice I could recall, do you have Flagstad's complete Isolde? He replied, yes, I have. That ended the scene, and I repeated it until it was real to me, felt natural. Late that afternoon, I went to that record shop to physically enact the scene. Not one detail supplied by the senses had encouraged me to believe I could walk out of that shop with those records. I had been told last September by the same salesman in the same shop, the same story my friend had received there before Christmas. Approaching the salesman I had seen in imagination that morning, I said, do you have Flagstad's complete Isolde? Excuse me. He replied, no, we haven't. Without saying anything audible to him, I said inwardly, that's not what I heard you say. He said that in here. As I turned to leave the shop, I noticed on a top shelf what I thought to be an advertisement of this set of records, and remarked to the salesman, if you don't have the merchandise, you shouldn't advertise it. That's right, he replied, and as he reached up to take it down, discovered it to be a complete album with all 5 records. The scene wasn't played exactly as I had constructed it, but the result confirmed what my imagined scene implied. How can I thank you? F.B. That was to Neville, of course. After reading F.B.'s letter, we must agree with Anthony Eden that an assumption, though false, if persisted in, will harden into fact. F.B.'s fancy, fusing with the sense field of the record shop, enriched aspects of it and made them his, what he perceived. Our future is our imagining in its creative march. F.B. used his imagination for a conscious purpose representing life as he desired it to be, and thereby affecting life instead of merely reflecting it. So sure was he that his imaginal drama was the reality, and the physical act but a shadow, that when the salesman said, no, we haven't, F.B. mentally said, that's not what I heard you say. He not only remembered what he had heard, but he was still remembering it. Imagining the wish fulfilled is the seeking that finds, the asking that receives, the knocking to which is opened. Let me repeat that sentence. Imagining the wish fulfilled is the seeking that finds, the asking that receives, the knocking to which is opened. He saw and heard what he desired to see and hear, and would not take no, we haven't for an answer. The imaginist dreams while awake. He is not the servant of vision, but the master of the direction of his attention. Imaginative constancy controls perception of events in space-time. Unfortunately, most men are ever-changing like a joyless eye that finds no object worthy inconstancy. I tell you, Mrs. GR2 had imaginatively heard what she wanted to physically hear and knew the outer world must confirm it. This is her story. Remember, we're working on hearing. Hearing is very, very big. It's, how do I say it? It's never without fail. That's a double negative, of course. Never without fail when I try it. When I hear what I want to hear, it's what I end up hearing. Some time ago, we advertised our home for sale, which was necessary for us to buy a larger property on which we had placed a deposit. Several people would have bought our home immediately, but we were obliged to explain that we could not close any deal until we learned whether or not our offer for the property we wanted had been accepted. At this time, a broker called and literally begged us to allow him to show our home to a client of his who was eager for this location and would be glad to pay even more than we were asking. We explained our situation to the broker and to his client. They both stated they did not mind waiting for our deal to be consummated. The broker asked us to sign a paper which he said was not binding in any way, but would give him first chance at the sale if our other deal went through. We signed the paper and later learned that in California real estate law, nothing could have been more binding. A few days later, our deal with the new property fell through, so we notified this broker, and his verbal response was, "Well, just forget it." 2 weeks later, he filed suit against us for $1,500 commission. Trial date was set, and we asked for a jury trial. Our attorney assured us he would do all he could, but that the law on this particular point was so stringent that he could not see any possibility of our winning the case. When time for the trial arrived, my husband was in the hospital and could not appear with me in our defense. I had no witnesses, but the broker brought 3 attorneys and a number of witnesses into court against us. Our attorney now told me we had not the slightest chance to win. Oh boy. Sounds like impossible odds. I turned to my imagination, and this is what I did. Completely disregarding all that had been said by attorneys, witnesses, and the judge who seemed to favor the plaintiff, I thought only of the words I wanted to hear. In my imagination, I listened intently and heard the foreman of the jury say, "We find the defendant not guilty." I listened until I knew it was true. I closed my mind's ear to everything said in that courtroom and heard only those words, "We find the defendant not guilty." The jury deliberated from noon recess until 4:30 that afternoon. And all during those hours, I sat in the courtroom and heard those words over and over in my imagination. When the jurors returned, the judge asked the foreman to stand and give their verdict. The foreman stood up and said, "We find the defendant not guilty." Mrs. G.R. If there were dreams to sell, what would you buy? Would you not buy your wish fulfilled? Your dreams are without price and without money. By locking up the jury in her imagination, hearing only what she wanted to hear, she called the jury to unanimity on her behalf. Unanimity on her behalf. Imagining being the reality of all that exists, with it, the lady achieved her wish fulfilled. Hebbel's statement that the poet creates from contemplation is true of imaginists as well. They know how to utilize their video audio hallucinations to create reality. Nothing is so fatal as conformity. We must not allow ourselves to be girt about by the ringed fixity of fact. Change the image and thereby change the fact. R.O. employed the art of seeing and feeling to create her vision and imagination. Here's her story. Her letter. A year ago, I took my children to Europe, leaving my furnished apartment in the care of my maid. When we returned a few months later to the United States, I found my maid and all my furniture gone. The apartment superintendent stated that the maid had had my furniture moved by my request. There was nothing I could do at the moment, so I took my children and moved into a hotel. I, of course, reported the incident to the police and also brought in private detectives on the case. Both organizations investigated every moving company and every storage warehouse in New York City, but to no avail. There seemed to be absolutely no trace of my furniture nor of my maid. Having exhausted all outside sources, I would try using my imagination in this matter. So while seated in my hotel room, I closed my eyes and imagined myself in my own apartment, sitting in my favorite chair and surrounded by all of my personal furnishings. I looked across the living room at the piano on which I kept pictures of my children. I would continue to stare at my piano until the entire room became vividly real to me. I could see my children's pictures and actually feel the upholstery of the chair in which in my imagination I sat. The next day, as I came out of my bank, I turned to walk in the direction of my vacant apartment instead of toward my hotel. When I reached the corner, I discovered my mistake and was just about to turn back when my attention was drawn to a familiar pair of ankles. Yes, the ankles belonged to my maid. I walked up to her and I took hold of her arm. She was quite frightened, but I assured her all I wanted from her was my furniture. I called a taxi and she took me to the place in which her friends had stored my furnishings. In one day, my imagination had found what an entire big city police force and private investigators could not find in weeks. Signed R.O. This lady knew of the secret of imagining before she called the police. But imagining, in spite of its importance, was forgotten owing to attention being fixed on facts. Her attention was fixed on the facts outside. However, what reason failed to find by force, imagining found without effort. Nothing merely goes on, including the sense of loss, without its imaginal support. By imagining that she was seated in her own chair, in her own living room, surrounded by all of her own furnishings, she withdrew the imaginal support she had given to her sense of loss out there, and by this imaginal change, she recovered her lost furniture and reestablished her home. Your imagination is most creative when you imagine things as you desire them to be, building a new experience out of a dream of fancy. To build such a dream of fancy in her imagination, F.G. brought to play all of her senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, even taste. This is her story. I love that phrase, dream of fancy. F.G. Since childhood, I have dreamed of visiting faraway places. The West Indies, particularly, fired my fancy, and I would revel in the feeling of actually being there. Dreams are wonderfully inexpensive, and as an adult, I continued to dream my dreams, for I had no money or time to make them come true. Last year, I was taken to the hospital in need of surgery. I had heard your teaching, talking to Neville, and while recuperating, had decided to intensify my favorite daydream while I had time on my hands. I actually wrote to the Alcoa steamship line asking for free travel folders and pored over them hour after hour. Alcoa steamship line is the same steamship line that contacted Neville on one of his trips, either going home with his wife and daughter or when he was going to New York from Barbados, going to Barbados from New York when he was with Abdullah, because he did mention in that lecture that the Alcoa steamship company had got a hold of him. I actually wrote to the Alcoa steamship line asking for free travel folders and pored over them hour after hour, choosing the ship and the stateroom and the 7 ports I desired most to see. I would close my eyes and in my imagination would walk up the gangplank of that ship and feel the movement of water as the great liner pushed its way into free ocean. I heard the thud of the waves breaking against the sides of the ship, felt the steaming warmth of a tropical sun on my face, and smelled and tasted salt in the air as we all sailed through blue waters. For 1 solid week, confined to a hospital bed, I lived the free and happy experience of actually being on that ship. For 1 week, confined to a bed, she had a lot of time on her hands. I lived the free and happy experience of actually being on that ship. Then the day before my release from the hospital, I tucked the colored folders away and forgot them. 2 months later, and she only did this for 1 week, forgot about it. 2 months later, I received a telegram from an advertising agency telling me I had won a contest. I remembered having deposited a contest coupon some months before in a neighborhood supermarket, but had completely forgotten the act. I had won first prize, and wonder of wonders, it entitled me to a Caribbean cruise sponsored by the Alcoa steamship line. But the wonder didn't stop there. The very stateroom I had imaginatively lived in and moved about in while confined to a hospital bed had been assigned to me. And to make an unbelievable story even more unbelievable, I sailed on the one ship I had chosen, which stopped in not one but all of the 7 ports I had desired to visit. Signed FG. To travel is the privilege, not of the rich, but of the imaginative. That is my favorite right off the bat, and because mainly I just did that. In August of 24, we went on a cruise, starting in Rome, ending in Barcelona, and stopping in about 7 ports, including Monte Carlo, including Livorno, which included Florence, Tuscany. As I said, Monte Carlo, stopped in Sanary Samir. There's another 1 or 2. I think there's at least 1 more. Oh my gosh, and I forget the name of it. Oh, Nice. All of these stops, all on a cruise I just experienced for my 25th wedding anniversary, August of 2024, from an imagining I started in March of 23, and I never told a soul what I was imagining. But in my imagining, I was going across the Atlantic. I'll make a specific video about these manifestations, but for the fun of conversation here, while on the subject of travel, my wife, who booked that trip and planned it to the nines, and it was our 25th and it was my sister's 21st wedding anniversary, I believe it was. We were, or 22nd. We were celebrating them at the same time, so we went on the cruise together. And my wife never was the wiser until we arrived at the top of a hotel on the Fairmont hairpin turn on the track of the Monte Carlo Formula One racetrack. There's a hotel called the Fairmont. We went in that hotel without plans, just spontaneously going for lunch, went to the top, went to the roof, there's a restaurant. And while in that restaurant, I was handed a glass, and that glass was the one I was using in my imagination the entire time I was doing the imagining. Again, this ended up happening about a year, 15 months later, something like that. The glass I was handed was this glass. This exact glass was the glass in my imagination, because in my imagination, the porter on the ship kept handing me a glass of soda water with a lime. That's what I was using in my imagination. And I would receive this type of glass, this exact style of glass. And while we were in the middle of the cruise, at the top of a hotel, spontaneously visiting it, I get handed that glass and I'm like, there it is. There it is. I'm holding the glass. I have a picture of it. I'll try and, YouTube isn't easy to do this, but somehow I'll get you a picture of that glass while at the restaurant. It's on my table. It's events like that that bring it to, when it comes to fruition, you're like, the exact glass, I mean, the exact feeling, the exact shape, all these cuts Everything was exactly the same. The fact that my wife got the cruise and was so motivated to do it, I never mentioned this to anybody. I didn't tell it to my sister, even though she was in part of the plan with my wife on what we were going to do on these different stops. I didn't mention it. I never mentioned it. But I did it for probably, I'm going to guess 3 months. And then spotty after that, just being on the cruise, mostly just for being on it. And then it came to fruition about 12 months later in celebration of our wedding anniversary. So there is one example of manifesting. And I'm trying to pepper them in. All these experiences I'm trying to pepper into these videos to keep them interesting because they go with the material we're reading when it happens. So that's how I'm doing it. But I will try and make specific videos and we'll see how it goes from there. But anyway, that's the story there. That's the end of chapter. And we're going to see you in the next one.